And recording is started. Welcome to the November 1st Monday morning meeting of SIG Apps. I'm Kenneth Owens. I'll be hosting the meeting. Co-hosting will be Janet Co. And let's jump into the agenda. Okay, as an announcement, you can see the apps updates from the KubeCon. Majak, Janet, and I all took turns presenting. That's pretty cool. And then for the discussion topics we had today, one was progress, deadline, seconds, and the semantics thereof with respect to what we do with deployment. I'm going to post that link into the chat. Okay, so where'd it go? Yeah. So in looking at the documentation, we never really do say exactly what the semantics are for progress, deadline, seconds, and there are a couple of kind of different things there. So the question is, does this change the semantics? This is a V1 API, and do we think these are the right semantics? Does anyone have any thoughts? Or did anyone want to discuss?
I think Philip or Trevor, they can give a brief overview of what they think should be done. Trevor has joined today's call. Trevor, would you like to go first?
I mean, I can explain why I like it. I'm not entirely clear on what the downsides are, but if people want me to pitch the upsides, I can do that. That's not really like the question was like, is this a change to the API, like an effective API? And I don't really have, like, I think that would be a downsides thing. Like, who could possibly be consuming the way that it works today that would like feel impacted by the change that I'm suggesting? And I don't have a clear story on that. So if I'm happy to step back and wait and see if anybody else has a clearer downsides pitch.
Well, why don't you give us the upsides pitch?
Okay, so the upsides pitch is that they're like people who create deployments. It's useful to have a sign for them for when it's time to step in and see if they need to adjust anything to like assist the deployment controller. And obviously, you can wait for available false if the deployment controller is like unable to recover and the disruption continues to degrade your workload. Eventually, you'll go available false, and that's a very clear sign, and somebody steps in and tries to fix things. But that's also a pretty late sign. If you just wait for progressing true, that's might not be anything bad at all, right? Like you're progressing frequently for many reasons, and that's great. The deployment controller has got your back, and there's a spot in the middle where the deployment controller is trying to recover from something or roll out a new change or whatever, but feels like it's not making progress as fast as it's been configured to expect to make progress. And then it can go, if it's mid rollout, it will, and you exceed progressing deadline seconds without making progress, it'll go progressing deadline exceeded and for like progressing false. And that's a sign that you're not available false yet, but you're not making the expected amount of progress. So an admin or whoever it is that created the deployment is being asked to get involved and see what's going on, and maybe something needs to get kicked or whatever to help recover. And so the upside pitch is that now this behavior would apply to external disruption that happens outside of a rollout, where it's not bad enough yet to be available false, but the deployment controller is frustrated from its lack of progress, and something is happening that seems to be worth the admin or somebody, like a robot controlling the deployment. Somebody needs to step in and give the deployment controller an assist, because it feels like it's not making the progress that it expected to make.
Okay. Janet, did you have any thoughts? You were kind of most closely.
I haven't deeply looked at this proposal yet. Let me take a look.
I don't have it all written up as like a KEP or anything like that. If that would be
PR.
helpful, yeah. If it would be helpful for me to phrase it in a less PR-y way, I'm happy to do that if we want to punt.
Yeah, that would be great.
So is it like, I feel like a KEP seems a bit heavy, but I can do that. Is there like a midpoint pitch? Like, I tried on the OpenShift side of things in a bug.
You could, yeah, I mean, you can, if you think a KEP is too heavy, because you could open up an issue and just describe it there. I mean,
Okay.
a KEP
Yeah,
would,
I'll open up an issue.
like, it is kind of unclear whether, so I guess the only concern I have is like, this would change the behavior for existing users, right? And I'm just trying to think about, do we reasonably see a way where this would break clusters if we added it? Like, will people get unexpected behavior that deviates from what they depend on today? So they upgrade their cluster and all of a sudden so like we always said that for conditions, you should not look at them as kind of a state machine, and bases should also not be a state machine, right? There are conditions that you look for. And you shouldn't like tight loop and expect them to come in a particular order. And we do call that out in the documentation, but we don't, as far as I can find in the open source documentation, ever provide guidance on specifically this condition and deployment progression in terms of how to interpret them, right? So like, we've never actually told people like, this is what it does and what you should expect. So the idea that, and then the behavior that you're proposing does seem, at least from my perspective, reasonable. So I guess like, it's always a balance with a V1 API. You know, we like to add nice things that help the community. We don't want to be overzealous and break people's clusters while doing that though. So I think that's just kind of what I'm still trying to get my head around.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Yeah, writing up the issue I think might be helpful to make the discussion a little bit more, I guess, inclusive would be a good way to say it, so that people don't have to look through the entire PR and have the deeper comprehension of the deployment controller code in order to chime in. So that would be.
Well, like the 2 seconds. What the change is that I'm proposing is that currently, if you have some kind of disruption that is outside of a rollout, there's only one replica set under the deployment controller. Currently, it will just sit in progressing true forever, regardless of whether it's making progress. It's attempting to, like the replica set controller is trying to add a new replica pod and not making progress, or making progress, and currently it will just sit progressing true forever. And the change that I'm proposing is that instead of sitting progressing true forever, if the replica set controller is not actually getting a new pod out for progressing deadline seconds, that it would transition to progressing false with progress deadline exceeded. So So people who would be impacted are people who are looking at progressing. That's the only thing that's changing. None of the actual like pod creation behavior is changing. It would just be people who are watching the progressing condition outside of a rollout. So there's just one replica set. They're watching the progression condition on the deployment, and they're expecting it to stay true in the absence of actual progress. And like, I don't know, on the OpenShift side of things, we have, it's not entirely clear what progressing means. There's like lots of corner cases around the edge.
So that's the fiddly bit, right? Like, I mean, progressing really didn't have any meaning outside the context of a rollout. So like, in thinking about it, do people look at progressing? Do they look at that field and think about like, is this, when this field changes, has a rollout been triggered? And is that a good way to even interface with the system? And regardless if it's good or not, are people doing it? Is kind of the way I'm looking at it, right?
Right. I mean, and so another option that came up was just to avoid confusion. If there is disruption outside of a rollout, should progressing even go true at all, right? So for a replica set, it's more clear because replica sets don't have, I mean, I guess you could change the number of replicas that you're asking for, but other parts of the replica set are not like high changing things. I'm not even sure what's allowed to change. So it makes sense to me that a replica set goes progressing true. I guess maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But basically, it's just like my spec has been changed and I'm adjusting to it is clearly progressing to true, and my spec has not been changed, but something underneath me, like a controller, my controller or a controller underneath me is actively working to try to recover from an external disruption, and what should progressing to be in that case is not clear. And one option that makes sense to me is to have it be just like progressing because my spec changed, and not distinguish between because my spec changed and because of external disruption. And another thing that makes sense to me is have it progressing just be about my spec changing and just stay progressing false when there's external disruption. But the current situation where progressing grows true on external disruption, but some progressing functionality like progress deadline seconds does not apply to external disruption. And I don't like that kind of splitting, going both ways there doesn't make sense to me. But that doesn't mean that somebody's not requiring it to make that distinction today. Yeah,
I mean, but I do kind of lean toward that. Yeah, I do tend to agree with you that like, I cannot think of why you would depend on the particular behavior as implemented today. Okay, so I guess the action item is do a quick write-up. We'll chime in and see if we can move this forward. And then if no one has anything else, move on to the.
Did you want just a
what?
Kube issue?
Pardon?
Like that. So I create an issue on Kubernetes.
Yeah, and just assign it to SIG Apps.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, can I give it a take?
Sure.
Yeah, I think like the disadvantage is that it's like blurring the difference between the progressing and the available condition, since like now the progressing condition is more constrained. And with this, we are just saying, observe the rollout. And once that happens, like until the progress deadline is reached, check for available if everything is fine. And then you can go progress and the deadline exceeded. So I guess it could be useful to have this behavior for some, but it could make the condition like more complicated, I think.
Yeah, to answer your question, Ken, I think some people are actually going to use the status to decide what the current phase the rollout is in, or the current state the deployment is in. So people can be looking at that status. So that's something that we need to balance. Like with this change, is it is it the same behavior that we used to have earlier? That is not the case. So that is something that we need to be careful of.
But it does seem to implement the same behavior in the case of rolling updates, right? And progression for deployments, at least, really was kind of rolling updates were kind of the context in which that was thought about. So like, I think for most users, it probably does maintain the semantics they care about outside of this one particular case, in which case the semantics are somewhat unclear. But as before, I'm definitely sympathetic to not breaking anyone's cluster. Like that is a goal of the community in general.
Yeah.
I mean, if anybody has like, here's a consumer that this would break, that would be awesome information.
That's kind of what I want to kind of look for, like who. See, I mean, like, you know, with SourceGraph, at least you can get a good hit across the open source community of who's depending on that code, right? And there may be private, you know, there are other repos you can look at and say that commonly interface with deployment to do other things, and you can take a look and see how they're using it. So like that is kind of the due diligence I wanted to at least take a look at, so I can get kind of an idea more broadly across the ecosystem, you know, how common would we think this be, and try to extrapolate there. And you can't necessarily, we don't have insight into people's custom tooling that they've built inside of their own organizations, but you know, if it's like never referenced anywhere on GitHub, it's kind of a strong signal that it's like, well, maybe it's not, you know, being used in that way.
And what was this? This is like Go's package, like the consumer links from their package GoDocs rendering that you said you source. Sorry, you were referencing some kind of yeah.
Right.
SourceGraph. What is that?
SourceGraph is kind of like an open source version of a product that came out of Google that they still implement on GCP called Code Search. So if you use it, and it's like you can pay for it as a product for your own repositories, but they index open source repositories for free. So if you install it as like a Chrome plugin or even an IDE plugin, you can take a look at a line of code and it'll find other repositories in the open source ecosystem that reference that code. So you can use it to look at like the Kubernetes client, for instance, for deployment, and see like, you know, what's being referenced there. You can use it to cross even repositories inside of the Kubernetes organization as well. So it's a code search tool. It helps you kind of look at where code is being used across repositories.
I can try to figure that out. How is that? So there's going to be lots of like, if folks are consuming this via like a command line client that's already been compiled, right? It's hard to bridge the multiple hops from like, are they using like Go for deployment status, and the progressing condition is one hop that is at least semi-structured, but then after that, if you hop more degrees of separation away from that Go, it's going to presumably become harder to follow that trail. So like if people are using kube control to wait on progressing, I think it's probably going to be hard to catch that with a search tool. But I can try to find this thing and poke around a bit and see if anything turns up, because we don't have to have an exhaustive search. We just need to find like one counterexample to sync this idea.
I mean, well, okay. I would just look for prevalence. I mean, if it's one, like if you find one counterexample in a repository that's like hasn't been touched in 3 years, maybe it's not that, you know.
Okay, well, I'll look around a bit and see if I can turn anything up.
Sounds good. Okay, I think Morten, is the next discussion topic from, yeah, it's from you. Did you want to talk about Pi Healthy policy?
Yeah, so it's more just to draw attention to the cap and make sure that someone takes a look. It's based on the discussion from 4 weeks ago with Jordan about how we should handle pods that are running but not ready in the disruption controller and during eviction. Both the notes from the last meeting and the recording goes into quite a bit of detail on what the issue is. So this is essentially trying to, instead of choosing one way or the other, it basically just says let the users decide how they want to handle those pods. So yeah, unless there's any questions, I wasn't expecting a big discussion. It's more getting a view of the cap and see if, yeah.
Sounds good. I mean, it looks reasonable. Basically, you want to have a backward compatible change in behavior and allow the user to configure it. So you're adding I guess it'd be an alpha API object to start with, or
A feature gate, and then
yeah. So you feature, okay, you're putting in the pod disruption budget spec, okay, and then you would just feature gate around it, and then yeah. And then the gate would be enabled by default. But even when it's enabled with nothing set, it would fall back to the legacy behavior.
Yeah, essentially. So the default, even after stable, it will not change the current behavior, but it allows users to specify exactly how they want it to work. So people can get around these situations where you have lots of crash looping pods and you can't evict any of them. So
yeah, I get the context. I mean, it makes sense. I think even in the cap, it calls out that like the only reason not to do this is if we think we have to carry the code and it's not going to be useful to the end user, but we already kind of have significant evidence via open issues and other conversations that people do want this level of control. So, I mean, it seems reasonable to me.
okay.
And you can tag us, Martin, on this. Like we have also started working on this, but we've not put up the cap yet. But I think we can work together on this. Like me and Philip can help you.
Okay, yeah, sounds good.
All right, those were the only discussion items we had scheduled for today. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to discuss?
Hey guys, I'm Mariana, I'm from AWS. And I would like to discuss, since we have time, just let me put here on the agenda. So basically we have a huge cluster with hundreds of pods, and our application is architecturing a way that all requests are shuffle shadowed to 3 pods, each pod in one AZ. And if one of those pods fail for some reason or are terminated, we are okay to the request is okay. But if more than one fails, we return a 500 to the customer. And we are seeing during node upgrades that like those updates are taking days, and we would like to try to speed up those. And we created this issue suggesting that maybe you could have some feature on the pod disruption budgets to allow multiple disruptions in one AZ, because you're okay during all the upgrades. If you are just disruption multiple pods from one AZ, our application is gonna be okay. We support that, but we can't guarantee today, because we don't know if we increase this number, if we're gonna start to get pods from others disrupted. It's gonna be a problem for us. So just maybe discuss here if this is something that you guys have seen that is would be helpful for others.
Yeah, I remember looking at this. My question is, okay, so what would, I don't fully understand what you would want the behavior to be here.
So the behavior would be like during node upgrades, I wanna make sure that I'm okay with multiple pods being disruption if they are in the same AZ, or for example, if they have the same label only, but across different labels, I wanted to make sure that only one, for example, or another number is the max.
But, so I guess what I didn't get was that, like, why couldn't you just configure the label selectors on the pod disruption budget and the disruption budgets of the various PDBs in order to get the same behavior?
Because you use the same like stateful set across, like you have a single stateful set across multiple AZs, and use the same like a pod label for the pod disruption budget. And we can't have multiple, like we tried to see if you could have a selector that allow us like to during deployments only disruption one of the pods from one AZ, and we are working in fact on something to do that, but would be, I think the discussion is more if it is something that would be nice to have on Kubernetes itself.
I see. I get what you're saying. So like, what you don't want to like, so one way to achieve the same result would be to take the state, like instead of having one stateful set, manage your capacity explicitly inside of each zone, and then use a pod disruption budget per zone in order to tolerate the disruptions you want in that particular intersection of failure domains.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want to do that. You'd rather just have one stateful. So how are you guaranteeing that the stateful set, like you're using scheduling predicates, guaranteed scheduling predicates to ensure that the distribution is spread across zones?
Yes, we use the topology spread constraints, the zona one to make sure they are spread across AZs.
So your use cases, I've got a stateful set. I'm using the scheduling predicate to ensure that it's spread across availability zones, and I'd like to have a pod disruption budget that takes that into account. Yeah, I mean, we could take a look. I think Morton's been the closest to the PDB code for a while. He might have better insight into how hard that would actually be to do, or whether so I mean, it would be a field addition. It's something that theoretically possible to do without breaking backward compatibility. But in terms of the logic inside of eviction and disruption, I can't offhand say like this would be feasible to implement or not in a reliable way.
I see.
Morton, did you have any thoughts?
I can also, I'm not sure how easy it is to implement. So would it be possible to achieve something like this by setting up one pod disruption budget per zone? You can't have overlapping, so they sort of have to be separate ones. But would that work?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the problem is that I don't want it to allow at the same time pod disruptions across AZs.
Okay.
Without actually doing a separate workload per zone, I don't know how you'd make it work with the label selectors and the disruption budget either, right? Like,
yeah, right. Yeah,
that's kind of hard. Like you can, if you were willing to set up one PDB per zone and one workload per zone, which is what I think I've seen people do more typically when they're trying to do this, when they're trying to achieve zonal availability, they're very sensitive to what they're deploying in each availability zone, and not just necessarily using the scheduling. Like this is an optimization basically, right? Like what you guys are doing is correct in the sense that it achieves the availability that you want. And it's reasonable in terms of like it's minimizing the number of manifests you have to implement in order to get it. The tricky bit is the disruption budget is like hampering your ability to upgrade the underlying infrastructure. But if you're on, yeah.
Yeah, this is something that you're considering also to, like, instead of one single like stateful set, have one per AZ and then have a specific pod disruption budgets and have for those, and make sure that we during node upgrades only upgrade to one per time. But this is a lot of work to, like, migrate this huge cluster to.
I get you. It makes your infrastructure harder to manage. It's
Yeah.
not a very user friendly. I hear you. It's not a very user friendly answer.
Mhm.
And we can take a look. We can't promise anything obviously today, but it's something we could take a look at and see the feasibility is. It would be like, I mean, the kind of two approaches, like if you're asking SIG Apps to do it, it means one of the maintainers or contributors here would have to go in, take a look, do the feasibility analysis, write a KEP to propose the work to do, and then, kind of drive that work forward. The other approach is if it was something that, if you were looking to make a contribution, going in and doing the due diligence to see, like, how feasible is it to implement, and then proposing that as a KEP, like proposing that as work to do that we could help you drive.
Mhm.
Would be another approach, right? That like, if you're willing to implement it, like, it's a little bit easier for us to, like, say, okay, well, we can help shepherd it and we can be responsible for maintenance of the code if we decide to accept the contribution and all that. Where we're at now is we'd have to go take a look and see if we can drive it. So it's kind of time permitting based on the contributors in the SIG, but it's something we can consider for sure.
Cool. Yeah, it would be nice maybe to have some contribution, contributor take a look just to see if this is something feasible to be done, if it's going to be a lot of work, or and also if that is interesting to have this kind of feature. And then I can discuss internally if it's something that we wanted to contribute.
Sounds good.
Nice, thank you.
Okay. Does anyone have any other topics you'd like to discuss? Okay. If not, we'll give everyone back 24 minutes. Thanks for coming. Thanks for bringing topics, and thanks for participating. See everyone in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks.